Hello, welcome back to our exploration of the ICH GCPs. You are in section 6. You made it. I'm sure by now you are becoming a pro at understanding these terms. So let's keep going. A sponsor. You've heard this many times, but here's the official definition. This is an individual, company, institution, or organization that takes responsibility for the initiation, management, and or financing of a clinical trial. So those are the terms involved. They're responsible, they initiate it, they manage it, and they finance it. Okay? And this could be a pharmaceutical company, it could be a research institution that is responsible for the product in the clinical trial. And let's talk about a sponsor investigator. So an individual who both initiates and conducts alone or with others a clinical trial and under whose immediate direction the investigational product is to be administered to, dispensed to, or used by a subject. The term does not include any person other than an individual. For example, it does not include a corporation or an agency. The obligations of a sponsor investigator include both those of a sponsor and those of an investigator. The most common type is the IIS, an investigator-initiated trial. So the principal investigator sponsors the clinical trial, and he's also responsible for dispensing it to the subjects in the clinical trial. Next, you've heard about standard operating procedures. These are detailed written instructions to achieve a uniformity of the performance of a specific function. So very common, there are SOPs in the clinical trials industry at every level, the site level. The expectation that you will have SOPs that show how you're standardizing and conducting the clinical trial, and in terms of operations, really to show that everything is uniform and you know what you're doing. And then at the sponsor level, there are SOPs that are used to govern all clinical trials. A sub-investigator. You've heard about a principal investigator, and then this is basically a sub who is not ultimately responsible in the clinical trial. But here's the definition. An individual member of the clinical trial team designated and supervised by the investigator at a trial site to perform critical trial-related procedures and or to make important trial-related decisions, e.g. associates, residents, research fellows. So it also says that we should refer to investigator. So on a clinical trial, there are many who are on there. Just the role of sub-investigator really is one that assists the principal investigator. And so there are a lot of changes in terms of who can be a sub-investigator, particularly here in the US. In the past, the site could designate several people as sub-investigators, but more and more companies would prefer someone who is medically qualified and who can actually carry out integral and critical trial-related procedures. So the key term really is that perform critical trial-related procedures. So the next is a subject that participates in a clinical trial. It's an individual who participates in a clinical trial either as a recipient of the investigational product or as a control group. Next is the subject identification code, or the SIC. This is a unique identifier assigned by the investigator to each trial subject to protect the subject's identity and use in lieu of the subject's name when the investigator reports adverse events and or trial-related data. So the subject identification code is what is used in the clinical trial. So when you start enrolling subjects or you're involved in a career that requires you to know what is going on with subjects at a clinical trial, you will have an identifying code for them. And it typically is many times it's the site number, that facility number, and then the subject number. So if it's facility number 1, then the subject might be subject 003. So subject number 003 at facility number 1, they typically assign the numbers in such a way that you can identify them with whatever site that the patient is being seen at. So this is to respect confidentiality. I know we had talked about this in a previous slide. Everything is done to protect the patient, to make sure that all records are confidential. And that's very key. A trial site is the location where the trial activities are actually conducted. We had discussed several types of trial sites. We have multi-center sites, right? We have situations where we have a main location and then we have satellite sites. So it could be structured in so many different ways, but it just at the basic, it is where the clinical trial is being conducted. It could be a clinic, it could be a hospital, but it could also be any other type of facility that has been set up and approved to conduct clinical trials. An unexpected adverse drug reaction. The key term here is unexpected. So an adverse reaction, the nature or severity of which is not consistent with the applicable with the applicable product information. For example, investigator's brochure for an unapproved investigational product, or package insert summary of product characteristics for an approved product. So here what this means is when an investigational product is being researched, there are certain adverse events that are expected. In some cases, if I'm working on a drug for headache, as we're working on it, we know that in some cases, patients will have, some kind of itching. So that's expected. We know they're going to get, itching. Now, anything that is unexpected is now a UADR. And the investigator's brochure lists, remember, the non-clinical and clinical data, and it captures every possible adverse event that can occur as a result of taking that product, the packaging of the product and its information and whatever corresponding documents typically have that. So I keep talking about this because this is extremely important. These are the type of events that are reported to regulatory authorities, and that way when a product, should it come to the market, these are things that we have to be aware of, and this is typically what will go on that package insert when the product comes to the market. So vulnerable subjects. Individuals whose willingness to volunteer in a clinical trial may be unduly influenced by the expectation, whether justified or not, of benefits associated with participation of a retaliatory response from senior members of a hierarchy in case of refusal to participate. Examples are members of groups of the hierarchical structure, such as medical, pharmacy, dental, nursing students, subordinate hospital, lab personnel, employees of the pharmaceutical industry, members of the armed forces, and persons kept in detention. Other vulnerable subjects include patients with incurable diseases, persons in nursing homes, unemployed or impoverished persons, patients in emergency situations, ethnic minority groups, homeless persons, nomads, refugees, minors, and those incapable of giving consent. So, if you see here, there are two types of vulnerable subjects. When we think about vulnerability, we think about the ability to easily influence someone. So in clinical trials, the first has to do with those groups that have a hierarchical structure from what is being explained. So, that can be unduly influenced. Maybe, there are cases where in the past a pharmaceutical company might give some money to the lab people to work on the data in a certain way. So that kind of undue influence, that is actually, there are many laws in place for that now. They're to actually influence someone in that way. So that's the first group, right? So you also have persons who are kept in detention, right? Prisoners. They're very vulnerable, right? You could unduly influence them because of the situation that they're in. So vulnerability refers to being in a position where you can be easily influenced. That's what you want to think about. And then, of course, the second group is evident. People who have incurable diseases in nursing homes. These are people in society who can be easily influenced, right? And so all of these ways of protecting subjects are part of the clinical trials. And I know there's a lot of talk about, they can just use anybody as a guinea pig and come run clinical trials. When a community is educated and they understand the benefits of clinical trials and that everything is being done for their protection, then it's a whole different scenario. But when we live in a situation where people are not aware of clinical trials, and then there are companies that just come in, as we all know, in some parts of Africa, right? There are companies that come in and they influence the population and they conduct clinical trials. without people really knowing what they're doing. So these are some of the ideas that are being shared and definitions, of course, so that you really understand this and you can easily educate your community about it. So that's it for vulnerable subjects. Then the next piece is really important, which has to do with the well-being of a patient. So the physical and mental integrity of the subjects participating in a clinical trial. Patients participating in a clinical trial, they have the ultimate right to do whatever they want, right? So if they're taking the drug or the investigational product and they're in your clinical trial, they have a right to stop at any time that they want. We also have to make sure that, they're okay physically and mentally while participating in the clinical trial. So there are quality controls that are interwoven into all aspects of clinical trials to actually make this possible, like obtaining of the informed consent. If there's a protocol amendment and that affects the patient, then they have to be notified. They have to see their physician or whoever is medically responsible at all the visits or the times that they visit the facility for procedures related to the clinical trial. So it's a constant interaction and really ensuring that your patients understand that at every stage you're there for them while they're conducting the clinical trial. And this is at the site level, which means the principal investigators and of course any institution that is the sponsor of the clinical trial also has this woven into place. So well-being and of course safety, it all links up to safety in a clinical trial is very important. So let's talk about a certified copy. A copy, irrespective of the type of media used, of the original record that has been verified by a dated signature or by generation through a validated process, to have the same information, including data that describes the context, content, and structure as the original. The only example that I can provide here is our patient records. Patient records are reviewed during a clinical trial because, for entry criteria, we have to know that they actually qualify. We have to know we have to have a full view of their life before they enter the clinical trial, their health. And then during the clinical trial, whatever events come up that are outside of it, we also have to make sure that we are checking that, right? And so we want to make sure that the documents that are being provided are real copies. Okay, if you're using a computer system, the expectation is that there is that date stamp, on the document, which shows that it's valid. It's a valid copy from the computer system. If you capture all your patients' data on paper, then you want to make sure that you have a system in place to ensure that that is a true history, a true picture of what the patient data is about. So that's an example of a certified copy. And you always want to make sure that, of course, if it's a paper one, then you stamp and validate it to show that it's a certified true copy. So let's talk about the monitoring plan. As you know, doing a clinical trial, there are different ways of monitoring. The most common type is the clinical research monitor who comes to your site. There is a monitoring plan that is actually in place, which defines it describes the strategy, methods, responsibilities, and requirements of monitoring the trial. So at that level, the monitor comes to your clinical research site at specific times. There's a certain way on which they have to train you, document things, follow up. But then there are other monitoring tools that are used in clinical trials that a clinical research site might not be in direct contact with, but it happens in the background. There are central monitoring plans, right? That says, okay, at this specific period, this is the type of data that we're going to review. There even might be remote monitors who are reviewing the data remotely. You have a data manager who's constantly reviewing everything. So the monitoring plan will depend on the breadth and the scope of the study. And in a small study, typically not a lot going on, just regular monitoring of the data. The research monitors come to the site, the data manager. But as it gets bigger and more global and across several countries, then there is a robust plan that is created for the monitoring of the clinical trial. Validation of computerized systems. So this ties back into ensuring that if you're using electronic documents, that they are the certified copies that we talked about with the date and the stamp. So this ties into that. So here's the definition. It's a process of establishing and documenting the specified requirements of a computerized system that can be consistently fulfilled from design onto decommission of the system or transition to a new system. The approach to validation should be based on a risk assessment that takes into consideration the intended use of the system and the potential of the system to affect human subjects' protection and reliability of trial results. There are electronic medical records now in many Western countries, and those systems are also present, I know, in some cities in Africa and other South America and other places. But in clinical trials, we have to make sure that your system is validated, right? We have to make sure that it is, typically you want to use systems that are closed, which means that there is a way that you can track who gets into that system, what they're reviewing, and what kind of output that they get, right? So that has to be looked at. And then risk assessment is huge. It's just something that is just in recent years, it has a big focus. It's just looking at the risk of using a system, right? I mean, what in regards to the users, the data that is actually inputted. Okay, so those are things that you want to think about. And then again, you're talking about human subjects, you're talking about safety, you're talking about confidentiality. So it's another layer of ensuring that we have confidentiality, there is safety, there is, analysis of risk in clinical trials by using systems that are actually validated. Okay. And so that's it. This is the end of this set of modules. Please listen to them over and over again. And if you have questions, you can ask them during our bi-weekly coaching calls. We are going to be adding more modules and that really clarify all the things that are related to clinical trials, documents and processes. So that way, as you're going through this journey, you can truly expand your knowledge and become an expert at all things clinical trials. So super excited that you're here. I look forward to seeing you on our bi-weekly coaching calls. And of course, there is so much more to come. And I'm really, really glad that you took the time to complete all these modules. And again, we will see you on the weekly coaching calls. Thank you.